conversation aims to unpack the factors that drive gender socialization, childhood, adolescence for young men and boys, and will illuminate the problems and patterns, mental illness, health, and well-being over their lifespan. It's a 60-minute session. The panelists will have a conversation for the first 50 minutes or 45 minutes. We'll have Q&A in the last 15 minutes. On that note, over to Srilata. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. Very gratifying to see so many people interested in masculinity and in this session on challenging norms, gender socialization, and men's mental health. There's a parallel session at this very moment going on in the next auditorium on women's mental health, and it's kind of interesting that the audience has been split in this way. We'd like to get a peep into the next door to see how many people are there and what they are doing. But thank you for being here, and thank you to the organizers as well for highlighting this topic, which we think is very powerful and interesting. I'm the director of the Ramalinga Swamy Center on Equity and Social Determinants of Health, which is part of the Public Health Foundation of India. We work on issues of gender and intersectionality, and we've been more recently looking at issues around gender socialization, and how does the way that gender is communicated in terms of attitudes, norms, behaviors, and at a very early age, starting at a very early age, how does that impact people's behavior over the life course, and how does that play out in terms of their own mental health? And these kinds of norms and attitudes, they solidify over a period of time. And even in clinical practice, I think, and our panel hopefully will talk about that, even in clinical practice, this is beginning to be identified as one of the starting points for the way mental health gets shaped later on in life. So today we have a wonderful panel, and I think that was a brief introduction that was given earlier, but I'd like to say just a little bit more about the panelists. We have Aparna Upaluri, is a global executive and a senior philanthropy advisor, and the founder of Antara Advisory. She serves on the boards of multiple global foundations where she nurtures philanthropic collaboratives, intergovernmental partnerships, strategic field building. And she was the chief operating officer at the Tata Trust, previously served as the senior global program officer for gender justice at the Ford Foundation. And she led the Science and Society program at NCBS and funded a performing arts collective. And she's an epidemiologist and public health professional by academic training. Thank you for being here, Aparna, today. We have Dr. Dhruva Aital. He is a senior consultant psychiatrist at Amaha, Bangalore. He is an MD and PhD from NIMHANS. So you're in familiar ground here, where he worked in the area of treatment-resistant schizophrenia patients. He was a visiting research scholar at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston. And he has also worked on substance abuse, misuse disorders. He's a trained Bharatanatyam dancer and teacher, and is working on incorporating dance and movement therapy into his work. Thank you for being here, Dhruva, and bringing a completely different point of view to our conversation. And then we have Nilotpal Kumar. He's a member of the faculty in the School of Development at Azim Premji University in Bangalore. His research interests include the sociology of agriculture, gender and suicide in South India, and he's the author of Unraveling Farmer Suicides in India, Egoism and Ennui in Peasant Life, which came out in 2017. So Thank you all for being here, and looking forward to a very sort of wide-ranging and open conversation. I'm not planning to structure it very much, so please feel free, but be mindful. We're being timed right here, so we can watch as the minutes tick by. But let me start with you, Aparna, and just to get the conversation going on. Your experience with encountering gender socialization in your own work so far, and you've been working in the development field and you have extensive field experience. And how has gender socialization manifested, if at all, in the kinds of attitudes and behaviors that you've encountered amongst some of the communities that you've worked with?
Thank you, Srilata, and thank you everyone for being here. We were actually just thinking out of curiosity whether the auditorium next door, where they're talking about women's mental health, has more men than women, because here we see more women than men. But I think it's clear that it was quite scripted into thinking about, gender roles very much in the binary, right? Along an axis that sort of cuts in that sense. So I'm going to get very specific. A lot of my work in this space more recently has been on really addressing the issues of gender-based violence. And we know that sort of hegemonic patriarchy can be deeply violent as a structure. And so as a driver of gender-based violence, another binary that actually cuts across is the binary between the private and the public. And the reason I bring this up is because the way that masculinity gets performed, and to a lesser extent, less visibilized, that femininity is expected to be performed, is very much also cuts across this binary of the private and the public. So if we take, for example, the sort of vast area of gender-based violence, we all know that 1 out of 3 women experience physical violence in one form or the other across the world. These are global statistics. We are familiar with the epidemiology. So in the work that we have tried to support over the years on addressing gender-based violence, and this seems to be an intractable issue, right? We're just not able to get the rates of gender-based violence down despite decades of work. It is becoming increasingly clear is because there has been, again, another binary, which has been sort of looking at the male-female continuum here as the male perpetrator, female victim. Right? And as much as we try to change the semantics around it, it again scripts the norms around behavior. So how maleness and masculinity is experienced in private and how it is performed in public is really where we need to be paying more attention. So at the community level, what you end up seeing is what we do in the development space in terms of programming is really trying to address a public performance of how maleness and masculinity is experienced. And there's very little either experience that we have or knowledge that we've invested in building around what is a private play. And how do you get deeper into this? And so at some level, I think increasingly what we're realizing, those of us who work in the gender-based violence space, is that unless we engage with maleness and masculinities in a deeper way, and not just in instrumentalizing and saying that we need to work with men and boys and get them to change their behavior. I think that's the most facile way of trying to address this, but to really engage with what does this performance of masculinity do to the private lives of those who identify as men. And I think that is something that we haven't really been able to crack yet, but I feel like we're at the edge of opening that conversation up. And what becomes important then is framing mental health as a social justice issue. And that's where sort of the idea that there is a social construction of maleness and masculinity, where maleness and masculinity is as much a victim of hegemonic patriarchy as women and femininity are, I think it just opens up an entirely new landscape for play. So I'll just pass it over to Dhruv now.
No, thank you so much, Aparna. I think you've raised some really critical issues, especially this issue of the public and the private, the performance of masculinity and its experience, in private spaces, and how it gets, internalized, And I think perhaps, Dhruva, in your own practice, you must have seen this and experienced, this quite widely. So if you could comment on that.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be in such an esteemed panel and intimidating at the same time. Now that I have acknowledged it, I am supposed to feel better. That's what we do with emotions. Anyways, that's how I start. And I'll start with some of the cases that I have seen, where of course I cannot pinpoint and say it is the duality between masculinity and femininity, but where the cases speak for themselves. The first one where it was around 45-year-old gentleman who was well settled, was a vice president in one of the MNCs, who has done it all, been there, done it, financially very stable, but now sees that there is no point continuing this rat race and wants to kind of take an early retirement. Suddenly reduced going to, say, gaming. Son is worried whether he is having depression, and he comes to me. And I talk to him. I explore all the signs of depression that we typically have. Does he have pervasive low mood? Does he have lack of interest? No, he has other interests. He wants to do PhD. Does he have easy fatigability? No, he's sleeping well, he's eating well. If I go by my rule book of what is depression, he's not depressed. But there are behaviors which are changing. He sees that there is no hope in the newer generation which is coming to his organization. And he's not willing to say that as hopelessness, which we see in depression, And I have to tell him that probably in the traditional depression, as I understand today, probably he's not depressed. But my point here is whether conforming to traditional masculine ways, will it affect the way how one identifies and expresses symptoms of mental health concerns? One. So that's been already noticed, and then we all know the prevalence of common mental health disorders, depression and anxiety, is twice more common or more common in women during reproductive age group, and it has been already, predominantly considered to be because of biological factors, the hormones, progesterone, estrogen, while severe mental health remains to be the same between both the gender. So I don't know whether that prevalence is because we are looking at depression in a way which is not so masculine, whether men prevent themselves from agreeing to the fact that it is depression because it is not masculine enough to kind of accept failure, accept that accept an emotional status. This is about symptom presentation. Then comes the seeking help too. One of my clients in one of the session was talking about one of the traumatic experience in childhood where one of the parent was beating him for something lame he did at the age of 5, and he had a smile on his face. I'll not go into the detail of what happened. I was curious, what makes you smile as you talk about this? And it was an online session. We are in a virtual world. And he says, I don't like to see myself sad. I see myself in the camera on the screen, and I don't like seeing myself sad. And how do I help this individual? If I am to tell him, say, you have to accept sadness, I don't know whether he'll continue to seek help. Do we need to change the ways how we provide help? In Australia, they did ahead of games for adolescent men. Before game, talking about mental health, than in a classroom setup. Right, and celebrities were involved in other country to make it more. So maybe the way we deliver the services to men who conform to the traditional masculine values need to be different too. Right. So, and these are two important things that come to my mind. I would leave it again with another case, Vignet, another client of mine who is in 40, who has lot of life event changes happening in last 6 months. Started with his 17-year-old long job having up and down, getting recently married within 3-4 months, and losing father all of a sudden in an accident. 2 weeks back, comes to me and asks me, can I take a break from the work? I don't know whether he was seeking my permission, because he very well knows that his company has a policy which gives him leave. But the question is he ready to accept the fact that I can be weak enough to say that I need a break? Or is it considered as a sign of weakness? Now I need to perform no matter what life throws at me. So I would leave it with this thing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dhruva. And what you just said actually brought to mind something that I have. A couple of years ago, we were working, with a group that was running a suicide helpline. And one of the people who was working there said something interesting. He said that, when, I don't know if this is true everywhere, but it was an observation that was communicated to me, that when women commit suicide, they often survive because it's like a cry for help. But when men do, then they succeed because it's done with a certain kind of determination. I'm not sure, something that you said about seeking help and being ready to accept help at some point. Maybe that kind of plays out in this way, I'm not sure.
Yeah, one of the prevalence rates say that completed suicide rate is more among men,
yes,
while suicidal attempts are more among women. Again, is it because they don't seek help when they feel suicidal initially? Is a question that can be open for interpretation. Yeah.
But that kind of takes me directly to Nilotpal, who actually has spent a lot of time looking at this issue. He went to Anantapur district for a completely different reason, as a sociologist, to look at farmer suicides, but did not expect to find the connection between that and issues around masculinity. And he has he has such a wealth of experience and stories to tell. So Nilotpal, please.
I have gotten away easily. Srilata, you did not ask me a question. Yes, that's true. Actually, I wasn't looking for gender-based self-harm patterns. This is 2004-5 when national media, and to some extent regional medias in South India, not rest of regional media in India, they were agog with these stories of farmers committing suicide. And 5-6 states were being implicated, The only non-South Indian state that was being implicated was Maharashtra, which is itself very fascinating. So I thought, let me challenge myself by looking at a South Indian case, and Telugu seemed to be a little easier language to learn for me because I'd spent some time in Maharashtra. So that's how I came here, looking for an explanation of why farmers commit suicide. They were committing suicide in good numbers in those days. When I started looking at data, I found that actually farmers in South India seem to have fantastic rate of suicides. Some of those rates are higher than what Japan has registered. Some of them are higher than what Australia has registered. For example, the village that I worked in, Anantapur, if you were to compute suicide rate, it would be in 80s. That's roughly about 4 times what WHO calls the high suicide rate. Globally. So that's the surprise part. I was there. I went to this particular part of Anantapur. Some of you, I'm very sure, are from Anantapur here or have traveled through Anantapur here. It's not too far from here. You don't think of a certain gender order when you look at that geography, right? It's a very beautiful, hauntingly beautiful geography in a certain way, right? Red landscape and very dry region and so on and so forth. So when I go to this area and spent about, a month there, the stories that I hear, those stories don't seem to have the, the framework that the media at national level and regional level was talking about, or at least some discrepancy there. For example, one of the stories that I heard in the village that I was touring, that a very well-known farmer there in his 50s, he was involved in harvesting groundnut, which happens to be the principal crop there. And there were about 40, 50 laborers working in his farm, right? And the farmer comes from the locally dominant caste there, and he is also one of the largest landowners of the village there. His wife is there also assisting and supervising the laborers. And one of the laborers around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when it's time now to, wind things up and go back home, generally laborers try to take a couple of, young stalks of groundnut to boil it and have it back at home, which is again a very well-known practice in these parts. One of the laborers is doing that. The lady loses temper and says, in a very aggressive Telugu, "Ray, why did you pick that up? Do you think it's your father's?" Right? And the laborer was taken aback, because these are cultural norms that large farmers are supposed to abide by, and so on and so forth. The husband, the gentleman, he sees that, he comes to stop the wife, and the wife suddenly pushes him a bit, like this, "You stay away," in Telugu she says. And the story suggested that he seemed to lose a bit of a balance, falls back, falls on the ground or something like that, goes home, doesn't speak to anyone. And the verb used in Telugu for me was interesting. He didn't speak to anyone, he just alagedi in Telugu. He was just feeling that pain of, having lost. These are terms that farmers were using to tell me the story. Avamanam, pedda avamanam aindi. Okay, in front of 40 people, he lost his honor. Around 2 o'clock in the night, in the yard, he drinks poison, and next day his body is found. This was just one of the story. The other story of a young man, 17, 18-year-old, says that he wanted his father to sink a couple of bore wells. The father was like, "Why should I take that risk? I'm doing very well, growing millets here." And the son says, "But look, I have seen other farmers in other villages sinking bore wells and getting into horticulture and making a lot of money, right? Why don't you do that?" The farmer says, "That's not my job, actually. What if there is risk?" The son says, "You have to take a risk. Bhayam enduku. Why fear?" Father says, "This is my household, you get lost." The son goes, buys pills, sleeping pills, and have all of them, right? So these stories began to come after 4 or 5 months, and by that time my Telugu was a little better, so perhaps I was listening to these stories. And that's when it seemed to me that what I'm finding is a gender order, a certain kind of gender order, which is in some kind of a turmoil. The sons contribute to or subscribe to a certain kind of gender order or gender norm, which the fathers are not subscribing to, right? And that led me into this kind of work that I finally did, which was to look at household relationships, so father-son relationship, wife-husband relationship, brother-brother relationship, and then perhaps find a very interesting kind of, insight that it's not about men actually perpetrating violence on women. It's actually the other way as well. Men perpetrate violence on themselves. They create conditions culturally in which all exit points are closed, and then there is no turning back. In Telugu, they call it the ideology of Porusham. So that's what my study was about.
Thank you, Nilokpal. The second story I had heard before. The first one was new. But Aparna, just circling back, I wonder, in your work or in any context, do you see it possible for individuals or even collectives to be able to challenge these kinds of norms and these kinds of entrenched, beliefs. And have they been successful? How could they go about it?
No, thank you, Srilata, and thank you, Dhruva and Nilotpal, both for telling the stories you did, because I think it highlights something that's sort of very central to the way that the development discourse around shifting these power relations sort of evolves. And unfortunately, today the development discourse also has become very linear and very, very much trapped in, again, these binaries, right? Even the way that we see, I'm going to try and place this in very practical terms, like the way the funding ecosystem works, let us say, and how civil society organizations or community-based organizations are expected to respond to these challenges, is it completely sort of papers over the complexity of power relations. So, Nilotpal's story in particular highlights the fact that in development discourse, gender has to be looked at as a complex set of power relations, not simply as male, female, and everything that falls in between. It's also about the complexity of the relationships within the binary that sort of cycles back and forth, and sometimes not even from one sexual identity to another, but also within yourself, right? So the reason I say this is because to place the fact that to see this shift at the kind of scale that we seek for the shift to happen is going to be very difficult unless we start acknowledging that we have already scripted these norms very deeply, even in the quote-unquote positive changes that we've tried to bring about. So if you look at the more recent last 10 to 15 years of work in sort of promoting positive masculinities, I wonder if we have already caused some damage. Hearing the kind of stories that you're telling me is again, the performance of positive masculinities could be adding another layer of pressure onto the way that masculinity gets generated and performed, right? And so with that sort of quasi-theorization on the back, I want to just give you maybe 2 or 3 different examples of work that we've seen. And this is not to say that they've all been successful, but they're attempts. So I was part of a collective of organizations that was working in rural Gujarat, right? To really understand what will it take to address, very typical linear development pathways, which is increase school enrollment for girls. How do you make sure that more girls get to school, right, and complete school? And we all know the very sort of familiar things, that the barriers which are around mobility, early marriage, all of that stuff. So this was a couple of organizations that came together and said, how do we work with the masculinities that are generated in these communities that actually prevent girls from completing school? So one of the key things that this organization did differently was they ended up focusing on what I was calling out earlier, this public-private divide, right? The private accomplishment of someone finishing school versus the public space access, which allows them to actually sort of exercise their freedom, their active citizenship, their right to public goods, etc. So what they did here is they actually just started engaging with the Gram Sabhas, not the Gram Panchayats, but did it in an all-round way. And I think this is the biggest lesson for us in the development discourse, is we often pick single issues and try to drive them through. But because issues are so intersectional, because gender relations are intersectional, caste identities come in, class identities come in, so not all men are going to behave the same at all times, right? So sort of your socioeconomic, sexual identities are playing into the expression all the time. So at the Gram Sabha level, what this project is called No Fear, and you can look it up. They've done some very interesting work. They started actually engaging with adolescent boys and girls together. And very often, many of the programs that work with men and boys just work with men and boys separately, and with girls separately. And very few of them actually take the risk of working with them together, right? And recognizing that the behaviors of how maleness and femininity get performed also happen on a spectrum. In Nilotpal's story, it was a woman who had pushed that man, right? So there was that possibility that emerged in this No Fear project, where there was a building of discourse across, the construction of power relations. I want to stay away from the word gender deliberately right now, to bring an awareness to where does power sit and how do we share power more equally. So, and that's the reason I said that this is a social justice issue fundamentally also, is to make those shifts in how sort of male mental health gets invisibilized is also an issue of social justice. Right? And so I think to have sort of the broader development sector engage with this as a social justice issue and not simply figuring out how we can get more women into the workforce or more girls completing school, but really looking at how this hegemonic framing of maleness is something that men also suffer from. Right? And the other is another project that we've done where we engaged with media. Again, like I said, we live in a time of absolute information overload. But the scripting of norms happens through repetition. And I think that's where we potentially have one of our largest battles to fight is how do we overcome sort of the repetition of the way that negative norms get scripted. And that's where I think we will have to take on tools from different levels of engagement where people get information and internalize them, whether it's the mass media, whether it's Bollywood. I think that would be the most powerful place to have impact. But there is a project that we worked on that actually tried to develop stock images that, in newspapers, every time I'm sure anyone opens a newspaper and there's something about a rape happening, you'll always see the same image of a woman screaming for help, right? So how can you shift that? So we've just we had funded an organization to actually develop a whole lot of stock images that break that image of how you see the man as a perpetrator and, a woman as victim. So just if you can see more of those things coming out, into sort of the public line of visibility, I think that power of the visual, there's some research that has also shown that can start to indicate some shifts in the way that we script perhaps even our neurological wiring. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Aparna. And thank you for bringing up that issue of social justice again. I think a lot of us who work in the development sector, we are familiar with, that framing and this is another issue to include within that framing, and not in, as you were saying, not in a facile way of bringing boys into, okay, if you're going to do something about increasing contraceptive use, then you have to talk to the boys and the men as well, but to do it in a much more deep and meaningful way. But for you, Dhruva, you deal with people individually on a one-on-one basis, and that's the relationship between a doctor and the patient. And this issue of social justice, I don't know how much that speaks to your practice, and whether you actually are able to see it in those terms, or you have a different framing of it altogether.
Per se, when probably I'm in government sector and then running government programs that may actually make a lot of difference to me. But when I'm a private practitioner and I see clients who come to me seeking my help, maybe it doesn't make a lot of difference directly, but indirectly with respect to how they prescribe to these notions. As a larger community is something like how Aparna was mentioning, how media kind of repetitively induces this notion, and even Bollywood, she brought in about Bollywood. I was just wondering over years how this notion has changed. Some centuries before, laces and extravagant dressing and even the heels were for men, to now for it to be shifted to women and then to be associated with femininity. And interestingly, even in the classical dance form, Bharatanatyam, when it was kind of given back after all the face-off that happened, that it is a Desi Atam and all of that, all the movements which were more graceful, which involved hip, which may have some sensuality involved, were taken off. And it was all structural, like very stiff. Odissi, on the other way, is very graceful. And Bharatanatyam, it was always there. If you see all the sculptures that are there, it is very much there. While the Bharatanatyam that you see on stage now does not have it. So even in women, Bharatanatyam was predominantly practiced among women. How the sense of sensuality and the acceptance of society's value system at that point changed an art form is interesting to know. Now they are bringing back that, and they call it Bharatanatyam, where the movements of hip are there, movements of waist are there, movements of other areas which may appeal as sensual are very much part of our classical system too. So I'm not sure whether I answered your question directly, but...
No, this is very interesting. Actually, another question occurred to me while you were speaking, which is, since you are such an experienced proponent of Bharatanatyam and also teach, do you bring that into your practice in any way? Do you see any meaning, connection between them?
So far, I was not. I have recently started training for dance and movement therapy, which is a newer system like any other art therapies, where dance and creative movement is used as a medium to help people. That's the answer. So dance is a powerful medium to communicate, like in therapy or in psychotherapies. It is speech, which is the medium. The therapist speaks and then the client speaks, while it can also be the bodies which speak, the distress of the previous memories of difficult emotions. So that's being tried in dance. Again, there is a challenge there. When I use the word dance, I don't know how do we associate with it. Am I flexible enough? Am I, if I can use word, feminine enough to dance? Or am I masculine enough to hold myself back and not dance? And hence there is dance and movement therapy. Well, movement is something that I'm okay with, maybe not dance. So ultimately in my mind, even if we go back to our own philosophies, it is ultimately it is not pointing that either masculinity or femininity is one above the other or one is greater or the other. There is Siddhanta of Ardhanarishvara, which all dancers fervently practice. And even if we look at Nataraja, the half of his ornaments are feminine in nature. So basically, which kind of gives away this vibe that there needs to be a balance. We are not saying that masculinity is wrong, but having a balance, being in touch with what is okay, that is necessary.
Do you want to say something about the dance? I'm going to give up.
No, it was just too tempting because Dhruva and I discovered our connection through dance. And, I think it's interesting that how, performing art forms in a sense also sort of script gender into your body, right? And I'm an Odissi dancer. And Dhruva's perception is that Odissi is allowed more sensuality than Bharatanatyam. But Odissi also went through its sanitization. So in my training, Dhruva, we were told that you only move your torso and not the hip because that's vulgar, right? And so this illusion that you get that in Odissi the hip is out is not because we move the hip, right? The hip is fixed. The hip is your erotic center and therefore you don't play with it. You just move the top of your body. And all of this happens around the time, remember, of independence, right? Post-independence, when, sort of nationalism is like literally written into blood. In fact, the agreements that the main Odissi gurus made actually was signed in their blood, right? So a little bit of nationalism goes a long way in scripting the feminine body as well as the masculine body. And we know that the greatest Odissi guru there was Kelunacharan Mahapatra, who had a body that was more feminine than most women's bodies. And I think this is where, for us as practitioners who are looking at sort of what do we mean by gender as a fluid experience, we also have to question things like histories of our colonization and nationalisms and how they produce certain rigidity in the way that we read gender. Thank you.
Nilotpal, so in your experience, I think you too may have encountered ways in which they were trying to build some resilience into this experience of masculinity. I wonder if you encountered any of those and whether you think that some of them might have been ways that could perhaps find some space later on as well.
There were openings for sure. There were moments in that cultural formation where there were potentialities of, at least critically thinking about what's happening in the society. So just to give you one example, all villages, most villages in Andhra or Karnataka would have what they would call a village bazaar, or banda as they say in Telugu, the place where men generally, and women are not supposed to be, seen there. So a lot of my 2 years' time in the village was spent sitting on the banda, on trying to, just see what people are talking about. There was a very interesting conversation that I once heard. There was a husband, and I emphasize on this role part, gender role part. The discussion among the men was that since Chandrababu Naidu started one of the programs of women forming SHG, women have begun to go out far too frequently. Okay? This is all men talking. And then there was one man who said, "What's wrong with that?" And everyone seemed to be shocked by that question, right? They said, "Don't you see that if women begin to go very frequently, there will be issues at home?" And he said, "Don't we have issues without them going out?" Right? So I thought that was a very reflective moment in which there could be some potentiality to, cultivate a certain kind of question. One. Second one, there were 2 suicides that happened very frequently in that village while I was there. And I was sitting once again on the banda, and it was like a very, very, very touching afternoon, or, the rural dusk as you would imagine. The sheep are coming back, the goat are coming back, cows are coming back. Unfortunately, the village has seen two suicides. So people were melancholic. And one gentleman opened out to me and he said, "There must be something wrong with our village." I said, "Why?" He said, "This is the 17th suicide I have seen in the village." Then I asked him, "Do you think this village is more suicide prone than the other?" And he said, "Yes, because the other villages in this panchayat, I don't see this." Right? So, interestingly, while we talk about high suicide rate regionally or even intra-regionally, my sense is that it actually differs from villages to villages. That's a sense I get. A lot of literature on suicide talks about suggestibility of suicide, a normalization of suicide. So that moment where he was able to reflect on the frequency and total number being abnormal compared to neighboring villages, once again is that moment of opening. Unfortunately, the external cultural situation and economic and political situation, we talked about Bollywood, but we shouldn't forget the Telugu film industry. My goodness. Every time I take a bus from, RTC, I make it a point to sit in Karnataka State Transport bus and not in Andhra, because they have these, video playing TVs and all of that, right? So I think the external cultural situation is really against these kind of reflective media, local Telugu newspapers and channels, for example, sensationalization of suicides in a particular way, or sensationalization of success and failure of farmers. what really means successful farmer? What really means failed farmer? Right? Does failed farmer mean that someone tried, at one crop and could not do it for 4 or 5 years? Does that mean farmers have failed? How do we deal with these notions that corroborate hegemonic masculinity among farmers, right? So to answer your question, I would perhaps strike a little more pessimistic note than perhaps was being, but I think that we are up against something really, really tough here. There are moments, but then there isn't anything that promotes further critical, questioning of those, norms.
Thanks. That kind of brings me, we also possibly have only a little time left, but it brings me to the last issue. And I think the issue of social media in general, Bollywood, and I don't know what the Telugu, is it Tollywood, not Tollywood? Tollywood, okay. And their influences, etc. But if we were to try and address this at a larger level, more institutional level, just quick thoughts from all of you. What would that institution be? I mean, is it the family? Is it schools? Is it some other, maybe the Panchayat, Gram Sabha? Where would you want to put your energy in order to really challenge these norms?
I definitely believe schools to begin with, because it's always about the generation which is upcoming. But it should not end at school, if you ask me. It should also, while I was going through the research, it says that these notions affect people at all generations. Even in geriatric depression, the idea of masculinity, the rate in which they seek help changes. So, but to start with, I may say it's good to start at school and talk about how fluid is the system and how it is not necessary to conform to one prescribed notion of what is masculine, what is feminine. Maybe that discussion should start at school.
Yeah, for sure. I think schools certainly are important. In fact, my sense is that the schools are becoming more important. Just to give you one more example to say this, again, potentialities. I found that a lot of gender discussion faced a contradiction in the area where I worked. The contradiction was this, that are men privileged to take liberties with their expected roles, or should they abide by their roles? So if they were to abide by the roles, there were cultural norms about reflection, criticality, and Telugu is such a beautiful language in that sense. Vichekshana was a term I constantly heard, that you critically look at your action as a son, as a husband, as a brother, and see if your actions are actually in keeping with the norm of reasoning and faculty and so on and so forth. But that was in contradiction with hegemonic masculinity norms of doing things as you wished. For example, playing cards at the banda, or staying away from home till 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock, and if the wife asks you a question, you start basically thrashing, right? So there were these contradictions. Now, one of the interesting things was that girl children, when they started going to school, they would often ask their fathers to tone down this masculine privileges. For example, alcoholism. So often 10-year-old, 12-year-old or 15-year-old girl children would ask their fathers, Nana, you shouldn't drink. And fathers then seem to listen a bit. Right? So I think there are potentialities there, beautiful potentialities in that sense. But I also think that one needs to work with Gram Panchayats. One needs to work with local level journalists who are very often from the same villages, by the way. And they themselves are farmers. And therefore, this circulation of good farmer, successful farmer, and all of that, they are the first ones to work on that a bit, actually. So I suppose these three are certainly nearest, closest nods from where something could happen.
Thanks, Nilokani.
No, thank you, Dhruva and Nilotpal. As someone who's working in the development sector space, I'm loath to choose one institutional formation over another as a location for where we can potentially see more change than others, because there is a significant interdependence of how power plays out. I agree with Dhruva that working with young children is important. But then how the work gets done, who develops the curriculum, how that gets translated, how are the teachers trained, all of that, the power for that sits elsewhere. Right, it sits with the Department of Education. It sits with your local gram panchayats, etc. So, in a sense, I think I would say follow the money and the power, right? In a sense, because that's where one sort of pulls at the threads of where change is possible. But I also feel like that's one thing that we don't invest in enough is what, Nilotpal, you were talking about, which is the power of the narrative, right? And while there are the larger narratives that Bollywood and Tollywood generate and keep up, there are many other locations where gentler, smaller, localized narrative building is possible. I mean, I certainly think that we don't engage enough with our arts and cultural other forms of sort of creative expression. There's such little resourcing for that. And I feel like both sort of in the development sector space, those of us who work in social justice, the resources to work with those forms. You mentioned the Ardhanarishwara story. This is a story that everybody knows. But where are the tools to sort of unpack that story, right? I mean, I always think about this Ardhanarishwara. Again, at some level, there is a continuum, but there's also one half of the body that's male and the other that is female. But the other story that I love is Shiva as a midwife. There is in Chidambaram, Shiva is actually a midwife, and he helps Parvati deliver Kartikeya. And there is another name for Shiva, I am Manavar, which says that he's a mother. He's a father who's as good as a mother. So in a sense that there are other ways in which you can perceive how to be masculine while being feminine. And these stories never get surfaced enough. And I think there are cultural resources that we have that can challenge the more sort of Western, hegemonic, heteronormative identities that we are also forced to adapt because our development narratives make us forced to adapt them. And so therefore I would think that we will need to think about, I share the sort of long-term pessimism, but short-term I'm pessimistic, but long-term I'm optimistic that we can make this change happen because we have seen progress. I do want to acknowledge that we're sitting here today in a mental health festival, which you wouldn't have imagined a decade ago. We are able to talk about gender as a spectrum, which we wouldn't have been able to, some time ago. So progress is happening, but I think we have to keep sharpening our tools all the time. Thank you.
That's a great point at which to start the Q&A, I think. And I'm happy we are ending on a more positive note, but yeah.
We can take around 4 questions. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a question, and this is more about our social conditioning about discussing a gender at a disadvantage. So I was challenged by a friend to work on gender gaps, and when we work on gender gaps, we as a society we do discuss women at a disadvantage, but when you research, or when I try to research, it takes a lot of effort to figure out spaces where men are at a disadvantage, right? Like the gender people who have died in wars gap, the gender people who died work gap, the gender people who take up dangerous jobs gap, the gender people who are in prison gap, the gender people who do worse in school gap, the gender people who commit suicide gap, the gender alimony gap, the gender child custody gap, right? The gender child identity fraud gap. There are so many gaps where men are at a severe disadvantage, but somehow as a society and even as, I would say, even the internet, we don't see this as a big conversation, right? The gender suicide gap, like one group dying twice at the rate at other, is not as big a discussion in the society or in the internet as gender pay gap, which is like one group getting 10% less in certain situations. So I'm trying to understand why, as a society, we are not open towards discussing gender gaps where men are at a serious disadvantage. Even like ChatGPT, when I ask for men, it will say, as a AI module, I am not supposed to make such conclusions for men, but if you just change the question and put women, they do give you a list.
Okay, great. Thanks. Just in the interest of time, I will request you to keep your questions precise. So, Dhruva, you will take that question. We'll just take one more so that we can answer two together. Yes.
Yeah.
Keep it short, please.
Sure.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for this amazing session. I'm a founder of a mental health startup. So one quick question to be, I'm also a filmmaker, by the way. So how the narrative of future is going to be? Let's say that right now we are in the world with 30-second attention span with zero tolerance. So if that is the case, what should be shown in the media? It should be the future, how the world is together, or the past where the disadvantage of, be it a caste, be it of, any violence against women. Should we keep on showing them again and again and again, or show the future? So what's your take on that?
Thank you.
Thanks, both are lovely questions. The first one, the gender disadvantage, I would rather stick to the mental health gap. As I said, I'm not sure whether men want that to be addressed, whether men want to know whether they're at a disadvantage of having higher suicidal risk. That may be one of the possible reasons. And as well as I have raised this question as how different is a presentation of mental health in men, and how we are not probably addressing or kind of getting all the mental health presentations in men with the current diagnostic systems. That's one of the reasons. While it is very important that we bring them to the discussion and then talk about it, right?
I think shifting narrative is something that's in everybody's hands, right? I mean, I won't place myself in a position where I give advice on what kind of narratives one should. I think it is in hands of you as an artist, right? To actually take the call and say, this is how I believe the narrative should get shifted. One could say that repeated images of showing violence against women is just going to perpetrate it more because it normalizes it, and therefore alternative visuals, narratives could sort of shift mindsets. I mean, that's a possibility, and that should be explored. And I think that's a sort of creative engagement. I do want to very briefly answer this question, the first question, just to say that, globally we know that women and those who identify as women have been at a historical disadvantage socially and economically. The fact that we're now arriving at a time where we're recognizing that because of the way that masculinity is constructed, both women and men are being disadvantaged. I think that's the shift that we need to make. I think for us to shift and say, actually, men suffer more than women, because we've been talking about women for 40 years, now we need to start talking about it, is going to make us lose again, right? And so I think what we need to recognize is that masculinity is constructed in a way where both those who identify as men and those who identify as women become victims of hegemonic patriarchy. And that's what we need to shift. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Just a very quick comment. Thank you for a very inspiring talk. And I think each of you is individually a very inspiring person. I did want to bring in the trans community as we're talking about men and women. And we're still talking binary. It would have been nice to see, perhaps, and Aparna, your last few comments actually inspired some more of this, a little bit more about those who are not binary and might be on very different queer spectrums as well. Yeah. So just a comment from me.
Thank you. I think what we've also, as an organizing team, we would like to say that we have tried to address men's mental health here, women's mental health there. There's a session on this, on margins and the mental health of people on margins tomorrow, so that we can go really deep into each of these conversations. So it's not to say that we are not kind of recognizing this as individual buckets. We understand the spectrum, but in the interest of going deep with limited time, we have kept it that way. But if there is any comments.
Yeah, no, thank you for your question. I appreciate that you've surfaced this, which is why I've been careful to say that those who identify as men and not just, whom the rest of us identify, people who themselves identify themselves as men, because we are recognizing that ascribing gender should be in the hands of the individual. So, but thank you so much for bringing that up.
And do attend tomorrow's session as well. One more question? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to appreciate that the part of art and culture came into this panel. I just wanted to ask the question that there are a lot of keywords we have taken today. That is power, and then there is narration, and there's one word you had mentioned, role and responsibility that plays in the part of a family and as a society as well. My question to all of you is that when we, as we said, that awareness starts from schools. I myself am a special educator. I teach at a school. And I believe that when this kind of awareness goes at a school level, there are a lot of things that our curriculum, especially in India, takes back at giving right narratives at the student level, right? Do you think it is the right time, and it is about the time for us to introduce whether something is masculinity or whether it's masculine energy? Where should our highlight in our own literatures and our own narratives towards our students at a young age should start from? What kind of a narrative should we provide them so that they move in the right direction ahead?
I'm not sure if I can answer it. But I think, once again, there has to be some attempt at differentiating our approach for different reasons, different age groups, and different kind of, learners that we have, right? For example, in rural India, I suppose the approach has to be slightly more different than that is for urban, and urban also different schools seem to have different catchment and so on and so forth, right? One of the things that I think works once again is that schools having cultural activities of the kind that does not allow exacerbation of the polarities, reduces polarities of gender ascription and gender identity, right? For example, can you have cultural forms like drama, and rural drama, by the way, is a major aspect of rural life in Karnataka, in Andhra, in Tamil Nadu, right? But can you have children, both men and women, learn about the kind of dramas that are performed in villages together? Can teachers attempt that? That could be one way of looking at it. Having said that, I have complete sympathy with teachers. They're anyways doing too much. So
I think we are out of time, right? Yeah. So time is up. So thank you very much. This was an excellent session, excellent audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.